Hello, my juicy co-creators. Lilu here in Houston, Texas with Dr. Joe Dispenza. Hello.
Hi, happy to be with you.
Very happy. I'm very happy to be with you too, and just spent some wonderful 6 weeks in Hawaii, met with Wayne Dyer and so many really juicy teachers out there that are impacting the world, that are bringing information that is very much needed, not needed, but that is really interesting for us to get and to hear and to share, because that expands our mind, that expands our consciousness. And you were featured in What the Bleep Do We Know? That was a tremendous movie that made a huge impact around the world, hasn't it? And it started to open up something at the time. And now we're opening up even further. Something is going on in the world, and we talked about it a little bit in our last video in Washington State, at your home, where we talked about the brain, of course, because you studied neurology, neuroscience, and the brain functions and memory and cells, and we started, this conversation was very, very juicy to me. There was a lot of very important things for us to understand as far as how the universe functions and what it responds to, and how we can reprogram our thinking to live our greatest potential. And this is the opportunity that we all have right now, isn't there?
I feel like it's a time in history where we actually have to take everything that we learn, you know, all this information, all this wonderful philosophy, this science, this theory. It's really time for us to actually apply it to our life, to begin to experiment, to see if we can begin to produce some type of measurable changes in our world. And the result of that is that human beings feel empowered, and that really is what it's all about.
Empowering ourselves so that we can bring innovation, as you were saying last time, and cooperation, and a whole new earth, a whole new dynamic, and new things that we can't even imagine right now can be created.
And I think the first step really is waking up, right? I mean, we're programmed and hypnotized into so many different belief systems that keep us limited. We're easily distracted. We tend to regulate our thoughts and emotions by everything outside of us, and that's really being victim to the environment. So I think people really want to see how they can change inside of them and be deprogrammed to some degree and wake up to a greater level of consciousness, and then to remember who they really are, and then use that level of energy, that level of understanding, that type of awakening to see how they can influence change, whether it's individually, whether it's in their family, whether it's in their workplace, whether it's in their community, or if it's really playing big around the world.
Tell us about the how to live the quantum laws, because you often refer to them. Tell us more about that.
Sure. Well, you know, I like to make it really simple, and you know, quantum physics tells us that on some levels, subjective mind has an effect on the objective world. For over 200 or 300 years, from Descartes to Newton to Einstein, there was a strong intellectual division between mind and matter. There was matter, which everything to do with the external world, the principles of gravity and force and acceleration. And the universe was functioning as a type of machine that was very predictable. And then quantum physics says, well, if mind and matter are related in some way, then how can we produce some effects in our life? Here's an example. When the scientists began to study the laws of matter with Newtonian physics, they noticed that there were equations that could produce the same effects. The mind, though, was too abstract, it was too complicated, so they created that division so that they would never be intertwined. When the quantum physics experiments started, every place where they looked for an electron to measure it, somehow it appeared. So it went from this wave of probability, these tendencies, all of these potentials, collapsing into an event called an experience, and that was a physical manifestation of an electron, something material. Turn their back on the observation, and then the particle moved back from a compressed density back into a wave of probability. So the observer had something to do with the nature of reality. Well, some people would say, Well, that's really great, Joe, and Lilu, subjective mind does have an effect on the objective world, but that's only for the really tiny, that's only for subatomic particles like electrons and photons and atoms. But it doesn't really have anything to do with anything like very large, like real events in your life. The observer does produce an effect on the tiny, but the question is, well, maybe we're just poor observers. Maybe we can sharpen our skill of observation. Maybe we can begin to use that principle to begin to collapse larger events called experiences in our life. And what is the principles to be able to do that? Well, we have to realize then that on some level that our mind has something to do with the nature of reality. And if everything out here in the universe is made up of electrons and protons and photons, everything's made up of atoms, and atoms are 99.99999% empty space, just energy, and 0.00001% physical matter. It begs two questions. Why do we keep all our attention on the physical part of it? And maybe we're missing out on something. So the quantum model says we're not going to use our senses to define reality. When we use our senses to define reality, then we're playing according to the materialistic laws, which says that Newton said that it's this type of predictable outcome that we have to define reality through what we see, what we smell, what we taste, what we feel, what we hear. The quantum model says that there is an energetic field where all potentials exist simultaneously. Mm-hmm. And that in some way, if you can change your energy, mm-hmm. change your mind, and you can tune in like a radio dial to one of those potentials, there's a good possibility that some future event will happen in your life at some future time. Now, we're not using our senses any longer to define reality. We're using our mind to define reality. So if the external world, that the environment is an extension of our mind, well then, if we truly change our mind, there should be some evidence in our life. There should be some feedback to let us know that what we did inside of us, in terms of the way we think and feel, produced some effect outside of us.
There's something called the flow, and sometimes the flow is not there and is not present. It seems like when there's flow, the maximum and the best possibilities arise, the best potential, the best of those parallel realities that are happening can really be there. Mm-hmm. Is that has to do anything with the flow, or there is a lot more to that to experience our best potential?
Well, the flow or the zone really is a delicate balance between having a clear intention, and then this is the difficult part, trusting in an outcome without having any sensory feedback. When you and I are totally in that state of trust, we're not really trying to control the outcome. We're kind of loose, and we are letting the outcome unfold without you and I getting involved, our personality getting involved. People who can do that and can just let it happen, that level of trust means that they believe in thought more than they believe in the conditions in their life, and so they can relax and not get in the way. And there's some physiological changes that take place in the brain as a result of that. We're not analyzing, we're not overjudging, we're not criticizing. The brainwave patterns aren't in what's called high beta, and when we're in beta wave patterns, for the most part, we're in a high state of emergency, and we're analyzing everything to try to predict some future event based on some past event. And that type of analysis is when we are overthinking and we're in our own way. When you and I have surrendered and relaxed, our brainwave patterns slow down, we're no longer trying to control the outcome, we're trusting in that outcome. And then the body relaxes, it's moving out of emergency mode, we feel more connected to source, less separate from it, and that kind of state of being sometimes requires us to be so fatigued or so exhausted or so overworked in some way that we finally surrender, we finally give up. And so I think that there's a way to develop that like a skill, just like golf or tennis, that if you practice it enough times and you begin to realize that there's some mechanism that happens when you and I are in the flow, and then work on reproducing it and turning it into a skill, I think that life would get very interesting.
Trusting in the unseen, that's a big one. That's a very big one and a very important one. Already feeling it and finding ourselves in a place where we already are embodying embodying all those qualities, embodying feeling that reality, and then the brain start changing, shifting, and being able to, how does this work? What's the dynamic? Tell us again.
Well, let's make it really simple, okay? Thoughts are the language of the brain. Feelings are the language of the body. So the currency of thought is what creates a certain level of mind. The currency of feeling, then, has everything to do with experience, okay? So knowledge is for the mind, experience is for the body. So your brain has networks of neurons that are arranged in certain patterns based on things you learn intellectually and things you've experienced in your life. So your forebrain is the builder, it's the designer, it's the CEO. And when you begin to speculate possibilities, when you start to think about a better way to do something, or something you want to experience, or something you want to do, or some future event, it's an amazing phenomenon, because researchers are beginning to show that not only do we remember a past, but the brain actually can remember a future. And so how does it do that? Well, because the forebrain has connections to all other parts of the brain, it can take a little bit of that knowledge from a specific neural network and a little bit of experience and another neural network of knowledge and another neural network of experience, and it can seamlessly piece it together to create a new level of mind. And then your brain gets a picture or an image, and then you transfix your mind on that image, and those neurons string into place that begin to fire and wire together. And every time you remind yourself of what you want to experience, you're reinforcing the circuitry in your brain to begin to install the hardware for you to actually experience that future event. In other words, the brain already looks like it's already had the event. Now that's super cool, because it really says then that we're remembering a future potential. Now, feelings and emotions are the end product of past experiences, and we can remember experiences better because we can remember how they feel. So when you're in the midst of an experience and you're seeing and smelling and tasting and feeling and hearing, and you're immersed in the environmental cues, there is a rush of information that causes the brain to pattern into specific neural networks, and then there's a very strong emotional quotient that the brain releases to the body. So then, if feelings and emotions are the end product of past experiences, then, is it possible then to tune into that future potential and put so much of our attention on it till it's real? And the end product of that experience in our own mind is an emotion, and we begin to feel how that event would actually take place or feel ahead of the actual experience. Now, we're no longer relying on the external world to change our internal chemistry, and then when we feel different, we look to see who or what caused it. What we're saying is now is that we're giving thanks ahead of the actual experience, or we're falling in love to the point that the body is, as the unconscious mind, is getting the signal before the actual environmental experience. The body does not know the difference between the event in reality that produces the emotion and the emotion you create by yourself. Now, here's the key. Most people use their senses to define reality. We all do. But the quantum model says we're going to use our mind to define reality, and we're going to convince our body emotionally that that future event has already happened. Now, when your mind and body are working together, when your thoughts and feelings are aligned, you're in a state of being. And that state of being is what that flow is all about. Now, some people would say, oh, that's nonsense, or that's so unrealistic. Well, it is nonsense. It's beyond the senses. And it is unrealistic because it isn't a reality yet. But you've already experienced it enough times that you can surrender now and let go, because you already can trust that somehow it's going to happen. You don't know how or when, and that should never be your job, because the moment you try to figure out how or when, you go back to that old identity trying to control the outcome. But if you understand that the quantum model says that there's an intelligence that will organize the event in a way that's right for you, and you've already experienced it enough times till you feel it on a cellular level, then you are in the state of experiencing it in terms of being it. And then when you're in that state of being, that is a personality. And your state of being is your personality, and your personality creates a new personal reality. So here's the beauty behind it. You can let go now and surrender to some greater intelligence and be tickled by the outcome, because you can't be tickled unless you know, unless you don't know when it's going to happen or where it's going to happen. But the physiology of tickling says that You can surrender and not know when or how, and you'll be tickled. So the universe wants to tickle us in a certain way.
Having an open mind, having a clear mind, and an open heart are two components that are truly essential, aren't they? So there's the, you explain quite well right now, the open mind, but there's the aspect of the open heart now that I would like to discuss with you.
Well, we talked about this last time to some degree. We have emotions that are derived from stress chemicals that we call survival emotions. Those are emotions of anger and judgment and aggression and hatred and fear and anxiety and depression and pain and suffering. Those emotions are chemical signatures from a primitive nervous system called the fight or flight nervous system. Now, 90% of most people's thoughts and feelings come from those survival emotions. Yeah. And they are very low frequency emotions, and they tend to cause us to become more materialists. In other words, those chemicals cause us to define reality by our senses. And we start focusing on that 0.00001% of reality, not on the 99.9999% of reality. So those emotions tend to be more dense. They endorse the ego to a large degree, and we become very selfish. We focus on our bodies. We obsess about things in our environment. We obsess about our hairstyles, our body parts. We get over-focused about time. That's what those primitive chemicals do. Now, most people consider that normal, right? Now, when you stop sending those chemical signatures to your body emotionally, when you say, today I'm not going to complain, I'm not going to blame, I'm not going to make excuses, I'm not going to feel sorry for myself, I'm not going to judge anybody, I'm going to stop that. Well, what you're really saying is you're no longer going to feed your body those emotional cues that is going to cause it to become more dense, to become more heavy, to become slower, because your body is basically gravitationally organized energy that's sending and receiving information. Well, every time you have a lower frequency thought, you're causing your body to feel more dense, and that then causes you to feel more at effect of your external world. But when you make the decision to no longer send that energy to your body, in a sense, your body is no longer being enslaved by those emotions, because on the short term, those emotions are fine because they were highly adaptive at one time. If you're being chased by a lion or by a tribe in some way, you better have some type of emergency mode to cause you to be aggressive or to run or to protect yourself. But it becomes highly maladaptive when you're trying to function in your world and it's happening all the time and you're reacting to everything. And here's the problem, is that the more you react to things, the more you're driving those chemicals to cause you to react even more. And then what happens is, in the long term, we create that particular aspect of ourselves as a personality. We tend to memorize anger. We tend to memorize sadness or depression. And then we say, I am depressed, I am angry. And what we're really saying, our mind and body are in unison to some type of thing. So when you begin to make the decision to no longer condition your body emotionally to those states, the body begins to become liberated. The chains of those emotions that are highly addictive keep causing the body to be knocked out of balance, creates tremendous polarity. So when you begin to fast from those emotional states, and you say, this isn't loving to me, living by this emotional state, and you start making those choices, as you inhibit those circuits from firing in your brain, nerve cells that no longer fire together no longer wire together. You don't use them, you lose them. In other words, you are pruning away the old mind. And if every place where one neuron connects with another neuron is a memory, you're releasing the memory of the old self. And if you're no longer emotionally conditioning the body to the same mind, every time you inhibit that state of victimization or suffering or pain, you're no longer signaling the gene in the same way that's causing the body to stay in its same physical state. Well, when you start liberating the body in that way, the absence of that emotional addiction is a tremendous release of energy. The body is releasing the emotion now, and as it begins to release the emotion, the polarity begins to unify between positive and negative, good and bad, and that energy winds up right in your heart. And you start feeling inspired, you start feeling liberated, you start seeing things differently because the filter of how you are perceiving reality is being removed, because the emotion is no longer causing you to view reality based on some past emotional state. And when you're running in those high emotional states, there's always a gap between how things appear and how things really are. Our perception is altered. So all of a sudden, you're seeing something in a more clear or more organized way. So when that heart starts to open, then you're no longer living as a selfish individual. You're tending to live more selflessly, and you're considering everybody, because that's what love does. Love includes everybody. So getting to that point for a lot of people, all of us, is the art. Because when we arrive at that place, we realize that, geez, I think I had this all wrong, all along here. And when we talk about opening the heart, it is a process of overcoming our limitations. And when we overcome some aspect of ourself and we liberate that energy and we're no longer addicted to that emotion, then we no longer can judge, because there isn't the chemistry to judge any longer. And so the body begins to reorganize itself into more coherent patterns. And those coherence energetically is what we call love.
And the energy, scientifically, you can tell that the energy actually goes to the heart?
Yes, there's been research done in California at the HeartMath Institute, where when people start paying attention to elevated emotions, when they're able to cultivate loving kindness or compassion or some elevated emotion, that the energy moves from those survival centers and it starts sitting in another place there. Now that's really key, because that tells us then that our body is changing because there's a shift in consciousness or a shift in our emotional states. And that elevation of emotion, or that elevated emotion or that elevated consciousness, begins to cause us to become more godlike, to become more divine, to no longer live as an animal who's trying to compete or get ahead. We tend to slow down, we're more present, we pay attention to the details a little bit more.
Tell us how friendly this universe is. Can we prove that? Can we know that? Because this is a dilemma sometimes, and most of us are raised as the universe is not that friendly place. Is it really?
Well, I always say that to live as if the universe is in your favor. Now, the only reason that it doesn't appear that way to a lot of us is because we've been conditioned and hypnotized into believing that God is some angry guy sitting on a cloud somewhere, and he's throwing lightning bolts, whatever that means, throwing lightning bolts down at you, and he's keeping score on whether you've done the right thing or the wrong thing. And if you've done the wrong thing, you're going to be punished by God, and then you're going to spend all of eternity in this one place. Now, the principle, the law in the universe is free will. So that intelligence, that objective intelligence, that observer that's observing all of this into place, that loving intelligence, honors free will. So if you're absolutely happy being unhappy, it will organize more events in your life for you to feel unhappy, because you are a creator all the time. So we're not punished for our sins. We happen to be punished by our sins, which means we're punished by our own attitudes, because we are responsible as a creator. We are a snowflake or a raindrop from a greater mind. And we are made of the same stuff. So when people believe in those false premises that they have no power, that the universe is an angry, vindictive, insecure God that is going to punish them for some reason, we know without a doubt that there's biological effects as a result of that. As an example, people who are infected with AIDS, the people who accepted their disease because it was a punishment by God, their their T helper cells, their white blood cells that were to combat the disease, were much lower. The people who saw God as benevolent and loving, their T cells were much higher. So in a sense, it's up to us in terms of removing the masks of the ignorance that we've been conditioned into believing. And the end result of that, again, is that we feel incredibly empowered by possibility. Now, your body responds to either experiencing a certain level of freedom, a certain level of responsibility, a certain level of lovingness. And if you accept that the universe is in your favor, and that is your free will, then in fact you begin to experience the fruits of that. If you believe in something else, but you're bad, or you're guilty, or you've done things wrong and you'll never be forgiven, and this is an unconscious conditioning that happens for most people. It's happening behind the scenes of our awareness. Then by free will, you experience the universe as that way. So we're quantum observers here, and so all the information that's coming out now, what you're doing, people who are interested in disseminating the information and making it available, is causing people to sit down and say to themselves, I got to rethink this. And what does the word repent mean? It means to rethink, to think again. So it's time to think again. It's time to rethink. It's time for us to begin to, by reason and by just contemplation, to say to ourselves, maybe all of this information was interpreted by a group of men that had another agenda. And when you start seeing through that, people are going to start experiencing a tremendous amount of freedom, and the world should change as a result of it.
Tell us in your personal life how you broke free, because your background and you're in chiropractic. So how did you actually break free from where you were to now having created this reality? Last time I brought the cameras to your place, and it was really like your reality is really a reflection of what you're talking about here. It's truly outside. It was very interesting, I should put it this way, for me to see how what you're saying is a reflection. Your life is actually a reflection of what you're saying. You truly created something that is extraordinary. Like stepping in your place was stepping in a new dimension, stepping in another dimension. There's something there to be said about that, and I think has it always been like that for you, or was there a point where you started really understanding possibly that by changing your own environment, then you would always then resonate at a different level and always create more? Is there a way for us maybe to do something in our own environment where we live, or go somewhere, or experiencing something, so that we can also expand this consciousness, so we can every day be reminded of this greater, bigger, brighter place we can always be in?
Well, I think it ebbs and flows. I don't feel like I'm any more special than anybody else. I do my best in all areas of my life. I have had many dark nights of the soul, but those are opportunities to look to see if what your beliefs are supporting you, and can you look at yourself and begin to make choices that maybe nobody else is making. Because when we decide to make choices, we look around to see, is anybody else making these choices? And when it's outside of convention, nobody's making those choices, right? And to do that, a lot of times you're considered foolhardy or insane, or in some way, you're losing your mind. And in a sense, you are. You're losing the familiar mind. And so when we make those choices to step outside of the box, there isn't much feedback in our environment to reaffirm our identity. So a lot of people return back to the familiar world, and even though the relationship doesn't work, or the career isn't going well, at least, or the job, at least that they have something to remind themselves of who they think who they are. And so for me in my life, I was raised with two really great, simple parents. And my father was an immigrant from Italy, and he just believed that if you provided enough for your children, enough opportunity, they'd find their way. So in a sense, I was blessed by two parents that were very simple. And for me, I reached a point where I was philosophically understanding a lot of the things that were important to me, but I got run over by a truck, and that was the beginning of my rebirth, where I had to take everything that I learned after I broke six bones in my spine and, facing paralysis and everything else, if it actually was true. Now, unfortunately, most of us wait for that moment of awakening to begin to make changes. And so that began my journey in looking at the way things really are. And I had to see what I didn't believe any longer, what I no longer wanted to put my attention behind, and where you put your attention is where you put your energy. And then decide what I did want to believe, actually things that I wanted to know about and investigate. And so the journey for me has been about not only just understanding the concepts theoretically, but then to begin to execute them in my life, because in a sense I'm a pragmatist. I want to know that if this works, let's see if it works. Let's experiment in some way. So I have a great group of people that are support people that share the same vision, and a great family and a great life. And so we work diligently in getting our behaviors to match our intentions, to getting our actions equal to our thoughts, to be uncompromising to certain things. And if you can maintain that with a certain level of flexibility to see what's working and not what's working, then you can create not just in mind, but there is an element of taking action to see how you can organize a life that you feel like you're contributing in many ways, whether it's in nature, whether it's in art, whether it's in serving people, whether it's healing people. I think at the end of your life, when it's all said and done, the only thing that matters is how you made a difference. So it's taken me some time to really grasp that and believe in it. But one of the greatest things that I get to see is when I see people transform, whether they're from Japan, whether they're from Mexico, whether they're from South America, whether they're from Europe, they all look the same. Transformation looks exactly the same to me. And so I think that when you then set up your environment and it begins to reflect your mind, now you're in a good place, because now you're no longer being distracted by the chaos of your environment. You've organized a space that represents your level of mind, and so you can relax into that and begin to create again.
Tell us about the power of us getting together with like-minded people.
Well, the quantum model of entanglement says that the moment you and I share an experience, we share an emotion. And because we share an emotion, we can then relate with each other because we understand each other's experience. And if emotion is energy in motion, then when we share some type of bond energetically, just like a sodium ion or chloride ion, we are bound beyond space and time. So the more people that share the same level of mind and share an elevated state, in a sense, is like a network of cells functioning together. That is bonded beyond space and time. So the quantum model of entanglement says if you do something to this photon over here, that if they're bonded in some way or correlated, when you affect this one over here will be affected immediately, and it'll happen faster than the speed of light. And in some implicit state, they're connected in the invisible, right? So if you have enough people that share the same level of mind, the same consciousness, they share the same emotion or the same energy, then they have a unity of consciousness that's pretty much working as a single-minded organism. Now, that is very threatening to a lot of, bigger organizations, whether it's corporations or government or whatever, because it represents people in a state of unity that no longer is living for their own self-interest, but actually to see if we can make the species do something really great and into perpetuity, into a future. So when you have a group of individuals that share the same mind, that share the same information, that share the same desires, and you inspire them, well, that feeds that energetic field, and it becomes a collective consciousness. And as we know, collective consciousness affects pretty much everything.
This is so exciting, so inspiring. I'm so grateful for this information that is coming out. And My beautiful co-creators, do you have any other question for Joe? Don't hesitate to post those comments, because we do read all those comments that you're posting under the videos. We do read it, and then that creates maybe a next interview. So we'll see around the world, maybe in Europe next time. Who knows? I know you have a big following in Europe too, so this is maybe the next step, huh?
Well, we'll keep an open mind.
Yes. Thank you very much for this moment. Thank you.
You're welcome. Happy to be with you.
Well, my beautiful co-creators, we send you much, much love from Houston, Texas, and continue to support the Juicy Living Tour. The Juicy Tour works on donations, so it's because of your donations and your participation and the comments also that you're sending that this is really happening. This is a beautiful co-creation around the world, and this is growing, manifesting, and transforming the planet. So I'm very thankful for people like you coming in and contributing to this conversation. Thank you.
And thank you for your work.
Hello, my Juicy co-creators. Lilu here in Houston, Texas with Dr. Joe Dispenza. Hello.
Hi, happy to be with you.
Very happy. I'm very happy to be with you too, and just spend some wonderful 6 weeks in Hawaii, mate with Wayne Dyer and so many really juicy teachers out there that are impacting the world, that are bringing information that is very much needed, not needed, but that is really interesting for us to get and to hear and to share, because that expands our mind, that expands our consciousness. And you were featured in What the Bleep Do We Know? That was a tremendous movie that we can't even imagine right now can be created.
And I think the first step really is waking up, right? I mean, we're programmed and hypnotized into so many different belief systems that keep us limited. We're easily distracted. We tend to regulate our thoughts and emotions by everything outside of us, and that's really being victim to the environment. So I think people really want to see how they can change inside of them and be deprogrammed to some degree and wake up to a greater level of consciousness, and then to remember who they really are, and then use that level of energy, that level of understanding, that type of awakening to see how they can influence change, whether it's individually, whether it's in their family, whether it's in their workplace, whether it's in their community, or if it's really playing big around the world.
Tell us about the how to live the quantum laws, because you often refer to them. Tell us more about that.
Sure. Well, I like to make it really simple, and quantum physics tells us that on some levels, subjective mind has an effect on the objective world. For over 200 or 300 years, from Descartes to Newton to Einstein, there was a strong intellectual division between mind and matter. There was matter, which everything to do with the external world, the principles of gravity.
To live our greatest potential, and this is the opportunity that we all have right now, isn't there?
I feel like it's a time in history where we actually have to take everything that we learn, all this information, all this wonderful philosophy, this science, this theory. It's really time for us to actually apply it to our life, to begin to experiment, to see if we can begin to produce some type of measurable changes in our world. And the result of that is that human beings feel empowered, and that really is what it's all about.
Empowering ourselves so that we can bring innovation, as you were saying last time, and cooperation and a whole new earth. A whole new dynamic and new thing that made a huge impact around the world, hasn't it? And it started to open up something at the time, and now we're opening up even further. Something is going on in the world, and we talked about it a little bit in our last video in Washington State, at your home, where we talked about the brain, of course, because you studied neurology, neuroscience, and the brain functions and memory and cells, and we started, this conversation was very, very juicy to me. There was a lot of very important things for us to understand as far as how the universe functions and what it responds to and how we can reprogram our thinking.